Have you ever looked into a mirror and felt something strange watching you back? That unsettling feeling, as if the reflection staring back at you isn't quite your own. Mirrors have always been linked to mystery, with many ancient cultures believing they were gateways to another world, places where spirits lurked or dark forces could cross over. But what if they weren't just portals to another realm? What if they were hiding something far more sinister? In today's video, we'll uncover the chilling tale of a haunted mirror, one with a dark secret, a reflection that reveals far more than what meets the eye. This cursed mirror traps its victims in a world of twisted reflections, forever altering their reality. You'll learn the haunting origins of this cursed object, the strange and terrifying events surrounding it, and the eerie consequences for those who dared to look too closely. Stick with us till the end, because the truth behind this mirror will leave you questioning the safety of your own reflection. If you've ever felt that eerie sense that something might be watching you from the other side of the glass, you won't want to miss what happens next. Welcome to our channel. If you love stories that send shivers down your spine, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss any of our spine-chilling tales. The mirror sat in the corner of the room, half hidden beneath a dusty sheet. Its frame, an ornate blend of gold and intricate carvings, gleamed faintly even in the dim light of the abandoned house. The glass, though covered with a layer of grime, seemed to pulse with an unnatural depth, as if it had seen countless lifetimes pass by. It wasn't just any mirror, it was an antique, an exquisite piece of craftsmanship, likely hundreds of years old. Whoever had owned it once had lavished attention on its beauty, polishing its golden frame and ensuring the glass remained pristine. Yet, despite its polished exterior, there was something unsettling about it, a feeling that those who dared to look into it would never be the same again. The mirror had been found in the attic of a decrepit house, abandoned for decades. No one knew exactly how long it had been there, hidden away behind rotting furniture and cobwebs. The house itself had a reputation. Locals whispered of the previous owner, a man named Gregory Blackwell, who had lived alone for years, locked away from society. Some said he was a recluse, a man obsessed with his own reflection. Others believed he had spent his final years searching for something only the mirror could show him. Whatever the truth, Blackwell disappeared under strange circumstances. The last known sighting of him was on a stormy night, when he was seen walking through the streets of town, his eyes hollow and wild. He never returned. Some speculated that he had simply gone mad, losing touch with reality. But those who knew the house well spoke of a darker possibility. They claimed that Blackwell had been consumed by the mirror, that his obsession with it had driven him to disappear, perhaps to be swallowed by the very reflection he had gazed into so intently. People started to notice that strange things had begun happening around the house after he vanished. Items were missing, doors had been found wide open, and sometimes the air would grow thick with a chill, even on warm days. No one dared to stay in the house for long, and it wasn't long before the building itself was abandoned, left to rot and decay. But the mirror remained. When a new family came across the house years later, they were unaware of its dark history. They stumbled upon the mirror while exploring the attic and, enchanted by its beauty, decided to bring it home. At first, everything seemed fine. The mirror hung on the wall of their living room, proudly reflecting the warmth of their home. But slowly, they began to notice odd things happening, small, unsettling details that they couldn't explain. Sometimes at night, when the house was quiet and everyone was asleep, they would hear faint tapping sounds, as if something were scratching at the glass. Other times, they would catch a glimpse of movement in the reflection, a flicker just out of the corner of their eyes. It was always the same someone standing just outside the frame, watching them. It wasn't long before their reflections seemed to take on lives of their own. At first, it was subtle, nothing more than an odd tilt of the head or a slight shift in posture. But over time, the changes became more pronounced. They would look into the mirror and see their own reflections acting independently, as though the glass was somehow controlling them. The mirror seemed to hold them captive, trapping them in a distorted reality that didn't quite match the world they knew. The family tried to dismiss it at first. They told themselves it was just their imagination or perhaps a trick of the light. But as time went on, it became clear that the mirror was doing something far darker, far more dangerous. One night, the daughter of the family, young Emily, was the first to truly understand the mirror's power. She was alone in the living room, sitting in front of the mirror and brushing her hair, when she saw her reflection, instead of mimicking her actions, grinned at her, its eyes dark and hollow, a twisted version of her own innocent face. It was a moment that lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough. She screamed, dropping the brush, but the reflection didn't move. It stood there, smiling, as if waiting for her next move. The room grew cold, the air thick and oppressive, as though the mirror itself was watching her, waiting for her to step closer. Soon after that, strange things began to happen more frequently. Shadows would move in the reflection, figures lingering just outside the mirror's edges, never quite visible in the real world. But in the mirror, they were always there. Sometimes, the shadows seemed to reach out, stretching their hands toward the family, just barely grazing the edges of the frame. The family became more and more paranoid, jumping at every reflection, unsure of what was real and what had been twisted by the glass. They tried to remove the mirror, but every time they moved it, they felt as though the room itself grew darker. The mirror resisted them, as if it had a life of its own, clinging to the wall, refusing to be removed. It was clear the mirror was not just a reflection of reality. It was something far more dangerous, a force that had taken on a life of its own, and it seemed to be growing stronger with each passing day. Those who gazed into it long enough would begin to see things, feel things that weren't really there, creeping shadows, flickering reflections, and eerie whispers that filled the silence. The longer the mirror stayed in the house, the more its hold tightened until no one was safe from its grasp. The family was about to learn the true cost of owning such a cursed object and what it might take to finally escape its grip. The protagonist was a man named Adam, a young, ambitious collector with an eye for the unusual. A few weeks ago, he had bought an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, a fixer-up, something he could restore to its former glory. It was a project that thrilled him, a chance to start fresh and live in a space filled with history. He'd always been drawn to the mysterious, the obscure, so when he discovered an old antique shop during one of his weekend strolls, he couldn't resist stepping inside. The shop was crammed, with shelves stacked high with trinkets, old books, and forgotten curiosities. The scent of dust and old wood filled the air, and there, tucked away in the far corner, sat the mirror. Its gold frame was ornate, covered with intricate patterns that swirled and twisted like vines, and the glass itself held an almost hypnotic quality. It was clearly aged, its surface warped in places, but there was something about it, something Adam couldn't quite explain, that drew him in. It was as if the mirror had a history, a story it was eager to tell. Maybe it was the perfect addition to his new home, a piece of the past that would add charm and character. He had to have it. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with thin white hair and a quiet demeanor, seemed to know exactly what Adam was thinking. "It's an old piece," the man said, his voice low and almost secretive. "Hasn't seen the light of day for years. Some people say it's cursed." He paused, as if considering whether or not to elaborate. But before Adam could ask what he meant, the shopkeeper added, "But if you're looking for something unique, then this is it." Without giving it a second thought, Adam bought the mirror, thrilled by the idea of owning something so rare, even if it came with a little mystery. He had it delivered straight to his new house, placing it on the wall in the entryway, where it immediately became a focal point of the room. For the first few days, everything seemed perfectly normal. The mirror added a certain elegance to the space, reflecting the light in ways that made the entire hallway seem larger. It was a beautiful piece, old, yes, but somehow comforting in its presence. But soon, Adam began to feel something. At first, it was subtle, just a strange sensation he couldn't quite place. Every time he walked past the mirror, he would get this sense that it wasn't just reflecting his image, but something more. At first, he brushed it off as nothing more than an overactive imagination. But then, the oddities started happening. He noticed, at times, that his reflection wasn't entirely in sync with his movements. One evening, he stood in front of the mirror, tying his shoes, and glanced up. For a split second, his reflection didn't match his actions. It was subtle, a slight delay in the movement of his hands, a flicker in the way his reflection looked at him. But it was enough to make his heart skip a beat. Adam paused, staring at the glass, unsure if he had simply imagined it. But when he moved again, his reflection followed a fraction too late, almost as if it were mocking him. The next few days, the strange occurrences continued. One morning, he was getting ready for work, brushing his hair in the mirror when he noticed something even more unsettling. His reflection was smiling. Not in the way he was smiling, no. This smile was wider, twisted, as if it were trying to convey something sinister. Adam froze, staring at the reflection, unsure whether he was seeing things or if the mirror itself was playing tricks on him. The smile remained, even after he stopped smiling. It wasn't him in the glass anymore. He quickly turned away, his pulse racing, but the memory of that smile lingered, gnawing at him. That night, as Adam lay in bed, sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept returning to the mirror, the way his reflection had behaved so unnaturally. He tried to ignore it, convinced it was just a result of his exhaustion. But as the hours stretched on, he could swear he heard something. At first, it was a faint sound, just a whisper, almost like a breeze passing through the room. But when he listened more closely, the whisper became clearer. It was coming from the direction of the mirror. Adam sat up in bed, his heart pounding. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dim street lamp outside. He strained his ears, trying to pinpoint the sound. It was a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, as if someone was standing right behind him, speaking in hushed tones. His mind raced. He wanted to ignore it, to convince himself it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. The whispers grew louder, like muffled voices, growing more insistent, as if they were calling him. Shaking, Adam finally got out of bed and walked towards the entryway. His feet felt heavy as he approached the mirror, the whispers growing louder with each step. He reached the edge of the hallway and glanced at the glass. The surface was still, silent now, reflecting only the darkened room behind him. But the feeling didn't go away. The air felt thick, charged with an unexplainable energy. He could almost feel eyes on him, as if something were waiting just beyond the glass, watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. Adam looked into the mirror one last time, his reflection staring back at him. calm and still almost too calm. And then, as he turned to leave, he heard it again. A whisper. No words this time, just a breath, as if something had moved within the frame, something too close to ignore. His hand trembled as he reached for the light switch, desperate to end the strange sensation that clung to him like a shadow. But the feeling wouldn't leave. The mirror was watching. It was a night like any other when the change first began. Adam had grown accustomed to the oddities of the mirror by now. The delayed reflections, the strange flickers when he wasn't looking, and the whispers that filled the silence when the lights were off. But that night, as he stood before the mirror brushing his teeth, something felt different. It wasn't the usual unsettling feeling that gnawed at him. No, this time, it was far worse. He had just finished brushing his teeth and glanced up at his reflection, as he always did, to check his appearance before heading to bed. At first, everything seemed normal. His face stared back at him, a little weary, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then, without warning, a slow, twisted smile began to spread across his face. But it wasn't his smile. Adam froze. The reflection in the mirror grinned back at him. But there was something wrong with it. Something evil. As though it were mocking him. The smile wasn't the friendly curve of his lips, but a cruel, twisted version. His own eyes. Those eyes that he had stared into every day for years. Looked back at him with a coldness that he had never seen before. They were hollow, almost vacant, and as the reflection grinned wider, Adam felt a shiver crawl up his spine. The movement was subtle, at first, but as Adam continued to stare at the mirror, he saw his reflection's face contort, as if the glass had somehow warped the image. It was no longer just a subtle difference. It was becoming something much darker, much more sinister. His reflection tilted its head, the smile stretching unnaturally wide. And for a moment, it seemed to look at him with a twisted, knowing gaze. Adam's pulse quickened. He couldn't look away. Even though every instinct told him to turn and run, the reflection's eyes locked onto his. And in that moment, Adam felt something shift. As though the glass had taken on a life of its own. It didn't stop there. Over the next few days, Adam began to notice that his reflection was growing increasingly malevolent. It no longer mirrored him perfectly. His own movements were delayed, as if the reflection were toying with him. Sometimes, when he smiled, his reflection would smile back, but the smile would linger too long after Adam's face had returned to its neutral state. At times, he'd catch the reflection staring at him with an eerie, hollow look, a look that made his skin crawl. His own face, which he had known his entire life, was now a foreign thing, something he could no longer trust. But the true horror began when the mirror's influence grew stronger. The reflection started to act on its own, as if it had a mind of its own, independent of Adam's movements. It started with small things. Things Adam could easily brush off as a trick of the light or a figment of his imagination. One morning, as he was getting dressed, his reflection reached out. No, he reached out. Even though Adam had not moved a muscle, his hand, without his consent, touched the surface of the mirror. The glass was cold, unnervingly so, as if the mirror itself had been waiting for him to make contact. He yanked his hand away, his heart hammering in his chest. He quickly turned away, but the feeling of the cold glass lingered on his fingertips. It was as if the reflection was beckoning him, urging him to do something more, something darker. He shook the thought from his mind. It was just a trick, he told himself. But deep down, he knew that something wasn't right. The mirror was no longer just a reflection of himself. It was something more, something that wanted control. The next day, the reflection took its control even further. Adam sat down at his desk, trying to focus on work, when he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. In the mirror, his reflection was watching him. But it wasn't just staring, it was smiling again. That twisted, knowing grin. It was as though the reflection was aware of him, aware of his every move. Adam stood up, feeling an uneasy chill run through him. But as he did, the reflection didn't move with him. Instead, it remained frozen, its eyes following him as if it were waiting for him to do something. Something he didn't want to do. His heart pounded in his chest as his reflection's hand reached out once more. This time, it wasn't just a touch on the surface. The reflection's hand moved down, and before Adam could stop it, he felt the sharp sting of a blade against his skin. His own reflection had cut him. He stumbled back, clutching his wrist in pain. The blood seeped through his fingers. But when he looked at his reflection in the mirror, it was no longer holding the knife. The reflection simply stared back at him, its face twisted into an expression of satisfaction, as if it had done exactly what it had intended. Adam's pulse raced, and his head spun. He had to get away from it, away from the mirror. It was controlling him, pulling him into a nightmare that he couldn't escape. Desperate to break free, Adam grabbed a hammer from the nearby drawer. He had to destroy the mirror, he realized. It was the only way to put an end to this madness. With trembling hands, he swung the hammer at the glass, the sound of it shattering echoing through the house. But when he stepped back, breathing heavily, the mirror was still intact. The glass was cracked, but the reflection stared back at him, unharmed, unscathed. He swung again, and again, and again. Each time, the hammer collided with the mirror's surface, but the cracks only deepened, never breaking it. It was as if the mirror was mocking him, as though it were made of something stronger than glass. Every time he left the room, the sounds began again, scratching noises from within the mirror, whispers that slithered in the darkness. He could hear them, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing day. The mirror was alive, alive with something darker than anything Adam could have imagined. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape its grip. As the days wore on, the whispering and scratching grew more frantic. The mirror was calling to him. It wanted him. And Adam had no idea how much longer he could hold on before the reflection took everything from him. Adam could feel the ground beneath him beginning to shift, as though his reality was no longer solid. The mirror's grip had tightened, its influence reaching deeper into his life. It started with little things, small enough that he could convince himself they were just his mind playing tricks on him. But the further he spiraled, the harder it became to deny the truth. He was losing his grip on reality. At first, the glimpses of things that weren't there were easy to dismiss. He'd walk through the hallway and catch a shadow darting out of the corner of his eye, or hear a creak in the floorboards when no one was around. His reflection began to look off. It was subtle at first. His image in the mirror wouldn't quite match his movements. But it wasn't until one night, after hours of staring into the glass, that Adam realized the reflection was no longer mimicking him. It was controlling him. One evening, as he stood before the mirror, something strange happened. His reflection, without warning, began to move on its own. Adam froze, watching in disbelief as his own image took a step toward the glass, without him even moving. It felt as though his reflection had become a separate entity, an independent force that was pulling him closer to the mirror's dark influence. His eyes widened in horror as his reflection took another step, then another, until it was pressing up against the glass. But when Adam tried to move, to step back, his own body refused to listen. He was rooted to the spot, as though the mirror had seized control of his very muscles. It wasn't just his reflection anymore. The mirror had become a gateway to something far worse, something insidious that gnawed at his sanity. He began to see glimpses of people he didn't recognize, faces in the corner of his vision, peering out from the dark edges of the mirror. There were whispers again, but this time, they were louder, more insistent. They felt like they were coming from inside his own mind, curling around his thoughts and twisting them until he couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. One morning, he woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, the weight of something heavy pressing down on him. He had a vivid memory of something he had never experienced. He had been standing in front of the mirror, staring into it. But this time, he had seen a figure move behind him. He turned quickly, but no one was there. It was the same feeling as before. Someone was always watching him, always just behind him, waiting for him to slip. He couldn't shake the sensation. Even as he went about his day, his mind felt fractured, slipping in and out of focus, as though he were being torn between the world he knew and the nightmare the mirror was pulling him into. In a desperate attempt to understand what was happening to him, Adam went searching through the house, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain the mirror's influence. He rummaged through the attic, digging through old boxes, when he stumbled across a dusty journal. Its leather cover was cracked, yellowed with age. He opened it, hoping to find some answers, and immediately his stomach twisted in knots. The journal had once belonged to Gregory Blackwell, the previous owner of the house. As Adam read the pages, he found accounts of Blackwell's descent into madness. The entries grew increasingly frantic as Blackwell described the same experiences Adam was having now, his reflection moving on its own, strange voices whispering from the glass, and the oppressive feeling of being watched. The journal entries ended abruptly, the last few pages filled with desperate scrawlings, as if Blackwell had been too consumed by the mirror to even write coherently. There was one final note, a chilling entry that made Adam's blood run cold. The mirror takes what it wants. It will never let you go. As Adam closed the journal, a cold sweat ran down his back. He had read about Blackwell's fate, but it had been so far removed from his own reality that he had never imagined it would happen to him. But now, the pieces were falling into place. He wasn't the first to fall victim to the mirror, and he wouldn't be the last. His reflection, that twisted, evil version of himself, was taking him deeper into its grip with every passing day. In a panic, Adam tried to flee. He couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the shifting reflection, the constant feeling of being watched. He packed a bag, ready to leave the house for good, to escape the torment that had consumed him. But as he reached the front door, the reflection in the hallway mirror seemed to call to him. It wasn't just the reflection of his face. It was him, standing there, waiting, beckoning him. He felt his body move against his will, his legs carrying him toward the mirror as if something were pulling him forward. Desperation flooded his veins, and he struggled to fight back, but it was no use. The mirror was in control now. His hands reached for the glass, but they weren't his hands anymore. It was as if his reflection had overtaken him completely, pulling him into the darkness beyond the surface of the mirror. Adam's scream echoed in the hallway, but it was swallowed by the glass. The last thing he saw was his own twisted reflection, smiling back at him with a cruel, satisfied grin, as if it had finally won. The mirror, with all its power, had taken him, body and soul, and Adam was no longer a man in the world he had known. He was trapped forever in the glass, a prisoner of his own reflection. As the days passed, the house remained eerily quiet, but some say the mirror was never truly broken. Its dark influence still lingers, waiting patiently for the next unsuspecting soul. The whispers continued, barely audible at first, but growing louder, calling out to anyone who dares look into its depths. Its next victim, you. So, the next time you find yourself standing before a mirror, ask yourself, what's really looking back at you? Remember, not all reflections are as innocent as they seem. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel, where you'll find more terrifying stories that will keep you up at night. Stay safe and keep your eyes on the glass. You never know what's lurking on the other side. This story is a work of fiction and is purely for entertainment purposes. It is not based on real events or real people. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Please remember to always approach such stories with a sense of imagination and enjoy them as thrilling tales of horror and suspense.